You are now listening to Conscientization 101, an online magazine combining reflection, music, and action through independent media.
It's very important to be with conscious African women and men. And I'm very excited to see Conscientization 101, to see Sister Zari there and the brother James, and to see that you have started an organization to conscientize the world, especially African people, about what's really going on in this world.
Conscientization 101.
A lot of these people right now in this conscious, so-called conscious movement, they're not actually living in that lifestyle.
Fakers.
That's why, obviously yourself, we're on the same sort of frequency. That's why you're listening to the same things I'm listening to, because we're sharing that same sort of thought. We want the same sort of things, and a lot of people don't want the same sort of things. Even yourself, what you're doing now is for the people. So everything is people-based.
Globally conscientizing.
What's making me proud of what this kind of connection here is that, no matter what is said, no matter what is done, you leave listening to our music with a feeling. The same way we're going to leave this conversation with a feeling. And that is the most important thing for I and I, the vibe and the energy and the feeling that you leave with, because you might not remember every lyric, but you're going to remember the feeling. So that's really important, and that's what I'm getting from what you're doing.
America began as an act of violence. America as a nation is rooted in violence, which is one of the reasons why it is one of the most violent nations on earth, whether you're talking about black or white. You see? As I said earlier, don't let that Constitution fool you and all of this democracy stuff talk and deceive you. What are its origins? The origins of America are criminal. And it therefore is what I call a crimogenic society, in that it breeds criminality because it is rooted in criminality. Why are you surprised? What are the two major acts of criminality that brought this country into being? The first one, of course, is what? The criminal destruction of Indian nations. Rape and robbery and thievery. Taking of lands and taking of wealth. Destroying of people's cultures and nations. Placing people in prisons called reservations. Slandering their culture and their character as people. This country is built on it. I don't give a hoot whether you love it or not. It's what it's built on, and that's the reality of it. And why can I call it a crime? Because I can call it a crime based on the white folks themselves. They came over here with the Bible in their hand, didn't they? They came over here touting something called the golden rule, didn't they? Do unto others that you would have them do unto you. Okay, so don't tell me they didn't know any better. They would not have had that done to themselves. And yet they did it to others. And so within the context of their own cultural definitions, and within the context of their own religion, they were criminal. Okay? And we have to face that. Of course, the next major crime was the enslavement of African people, was the destruction of African civilizations. You talk about the disruption of the black family, as if that disruption occurred since the 1960s and 70s. The disruption of the African family began with slavery. That's where it started. And the disruption of African culture, the disruption of social relations and arrangements and institutions of African people began with slavery, and it has not stopped yet. And yet millions of our people died in this process and were killed in this process. And we have an endless history of death, damnation, and destruction. The coercion of our people into work, a slandering of our culture, and the slandering of our character, the lynching of our people, the physical abuse of our people, the racial discrimination against our people. All of these things with which we are familiar have been practiced from day one in this country. And these practices are criminal. And therefore America is rooted in this criminality. People not only dominate other people, they rationalize that domination. They make an excuse for dominating other people. So the whites had to rationalize their immoral behavior that was even condemned by their own Bible and by their own God. They had to rationalize the murder of Indians and the enslavement of black folk. And in order to rationalize it then, they had to create a racial mythology that we were born to be slaves. You see? So they're not doing anything wrong. This is right in line with God's plan. They brushed off that old dusty myth of Ham to try to convince themselves and us that somehow in the divine order of things, we were designed to be the servants of others. And yet even the reading of that thing itself does not say that at all. But people believe it because it is a part of the racial mythology that has been laid down, you see. And so many of us are willing to forgive those other people for what they've done and ask nothing from them because in a sense we've subconsciously internalized these kind of mythologies, you see, that somehow we are people who are supposed to be the servants of other people. And therefore, that's one reason why we think that they're going to be exempted from the law. The Indians were destroyed because they were what? Savages. Okay? They're the savages. They're the ones without civilization. They fed you when you got in, would have starved to death, maintained the white colonies and so forth. And what thanks did they get for it? Death. Why? Because they were savages. So again, what do you got? Oppression. Things being done what? Turned around. Turned backwards. You see, the victim is made to appear to be the perpetrator.
Welcome to another episode of Conscientization 101. Your co-host.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Conscientization 101 podcast. I'm your host for this episode, James Stone, senior editor for Conscientization 101. Today we conclude our 3-part series, Wielding Words Like Weapons with Ward Churchill. I know, but guess what? You can always go back and listen to these podcast episodes, and even better, you can get the 3-part unabridged interviews because we didn't touch on half the information in these episodes. And check this, what you really want to do to fully appreciate the unabridged interviews is get you a copy of
Wielding Words Like Weapons, Selected Essays in Indigenism, 1995 through 2005 by Ward Churchill.
And use the unabridged interviews as a supplemental tool to the book. Now, as you know from listening to the previous episodes, 51 to 52, this series is a dialogue between Conscientization 101 and acclaimed American Indian movement activist intellectual Ward Churchill about his phenomenal book, Wielding Words Like Weapons, Selected Essays in Indigenism, 1995 through 2005. These dialogues took place over the course of 2 days, September 15th, 2018 and October 27th, 2018. So similar to the previous episode, 52, what you're about to hear today comes from our second day of dialogue, October 27th, 2018. As we mentioned, that whole day of dialogue went for over 4 hours. Yeah. So we broke up this day of dialogue into 2 parts. Podcast episode 52 was the abridged version of part 2 of this series, as you know. And what you are about to hear today is the abridged version of part 3 of this series.
The conclusion of the series. My God.
Now, the unabridged version of part 3 actually comes in at a little over 90 minutes. And boy, we went out with a bang!
Well, we are wielding words like weapons. Boy, Churchill, what do you expect?
So the total unabridged runtime for the entire 3-part series comes in at over 5.5 hours. We told you you haven't heard the half of everything. We will let you know how to get the entire series at the end of the show. But for now, let's get into the abridged version of part 3, shall we? So if you notice, we opened this episode with some words from our dear late brother, Dr. Amos Wilson, because we thought it dovetailed perfectly for what was going to be featured on this particular episode. And what we discussed today on this episode is the effects of the settler colonial polity of Canada on American Indians. Now look here, when we say, like we done said before in other episodes, when we say settler colonial, we want you to think genocidal, okay? Death, destruction, mayhem. It's not some euphemism saying, oh, look at this is colonial times. It's death times. That's what you need to think. So when they say, oh, the settlers, the frontiersmen, the pioneer, that's another word for death dealer. Don't get caught up in these euphemisms of these this Western lexicon that goes to war with you with words so you don't understand. That's death. So when we say Canada is a settler colonial polity, we want you to say, oh shit. So we got to stop thinking in reference just to the United States and say, oh, you know, slavery and bad stuff just happened in the U.S. Y'all remember Columbus didn't make it to Norte de Americano, okay? So this bad shit been happening way before the U.S. And then, you know, Canada, a little late settler colonial power, they came in after everything went down. But you know, they from the British and the French, okay? There's American Indians up there, okay? That's talk about the Turtle Island, okay? I just want y'all to put that in your mind. Again, we want to refer back to the opening with what Dr. Amos Wilson was talking about, okay? And we examine this relationship, you know, between American Indians and the settler colonial polity of Canada through looking at a chapter in Wielding Words Like Weapons. The chapter is entitled Kizhiibaabinesik. The chapter is a poignant dedication to Brother Ward's late wife, Leah Renae Kelly. Now, check this out. I could be more detailed, but hell, you came here to listen to the dialogue, not me talk about the dialogue.
So, let's begin the conclusion of Wielding Words Like Weapons with Ward Churchill now.
All right, so moving on in our next question in the extremely personal and heartfelt chapter in dedication to your late wife, Leah Renae Kelly, titled, please, Ward, help me say that name.
Kizhiibaabinesik.
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 Okay. Kizhiibaabinesik. Got it?
Yes, that
Okay.
sounds right.
Which is her indigenous name from her nation of the Lynx clan Ojibwa, which means being who circles with the birds. You discuss the foundational governing ethos of settler colonial societies, in this case, Canada, and how it continues to destroy real lives. The genocide of settler colonialism is not an event of long ago in the past, but one that is of necessity continuously operative and subjects indigenous people not only to physical violence, but also what Dr. Amos Wilson termed psychic violence. We must say that Canada ad nauseum is held up as some sort of beacon of North American democracy as presented by liberal settlers of the U.S. One in particular, I could say Michael Moore. He remember bowling for Colorado. Canada's so great. Yeah, whatever. But the truth of the matter differs with this propagandized farce, as it is just as genocidal as its neighbor to the south. If you could please discuss the history and practice of Canada's notorious residential schools and the effects this has on Indigenous people and how they shaped Leah. And could you also discuss this as it relates to Leah's situation in terms of her being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, BDP, and how the therapeutic settler state, settler state therapeutics, as I called it, modus operandi in terms of caregiving, obfuscates diagnosis with the standard panacea of getting individuals to adjust or cope. You know, it's not even equipped to try to solve the real actual problem. So could you unpack all that if you would?
Wow. Well, the residential school system, as it's called in Canada, down here called them boarding schools, industrial schools. Actually, the terms are all interchangeable. The boarding schools were residential schools, and often they had training programs at the industrial part. And often in the training programs, they were actually manufacturing things to help finance the schools. So they were essentially child slave laborers. Mm-hmm. Okay. They didn't really have a choice but to be there, and they would try to escape. But the object there was instated. I quoted Richard Henry Pratt down here saying the object was to kill the Indian, save the man. Okay, destroy sense of indigenous identity, certainly knowledge of tradition, deny the students that, and Christianize them, particularly in Canada. That happened down here too, but down here, these were largely government schools. Up there, the government licensed the churches to run the schools. So you have Catholic and Anglican or Episcopalian, and so on, schools that were run, but they all had the same objective, which was to deconstruct identity. They wanted children as early as possible, and it was compulsory. Their object, they never reached it either down here or up there, was to get all of the children processed through these schools so that you simply have a die out of indigenous consciousness, indigenous identity. Native people would simply merge, be assimilated, integrated, absorbed by the overburdened settler society. Duncan Campbell Scott, who presided over the residential school system up there, who was a counterpart to Pratt down here, never quite so poetic, but this is the resolution to the Indian question, is simply to eliminate the Indians this way. And that's considered a humane alternative, this kind of indoctrination, cultural assimilation, forcibly, it's coercively. So that qualifies under the definition, as Limkin advanced it, of genocide. In fact, he said that's a normative procedure. Physical genocide is atypical. It happens, and the concept has to encompass that process. But usually it's overlapping. This would be cultural genocide, as they call it, which is not something distinct from genocide per se. They like to talk about ethnocide. And if you look in the chapter of Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, where he coins the term and defines the term genocide, there's a footnote at the bottom that says I could just as easily have called this ethnocide, but for stylistic preference or whatever I've selected. In other words, ethnocide is a synonym. It's not a separate category. Okay. I say overlapping because part of the process is up there, Duncan Campbell Scott pointed out that half, 1 in 2 of the students being taken to the schools never lived to enjoy the benefits. That's the way he put it. You got a 50% mortality rate in these institutions, which are underfunded, medical care almost non-existent, food was poor at best, And there's this continuous abuse, there's continuous trauma, there's early separation from your family, there's, assume the indoctrination takes hold, okay, you're coming to revile things in the same sense dominant society is, but you look in the mirror, what do you see? You don't see a white face staring back, you see an Indian face staring back. You got innumerable cases of kids trying to run away from this, some of them successfully, but then the authorities will come to their home and take them back to the school, and you've got quite a number who die in the process of trying to get away from the school. A really famous case in the 1960s of I believe he was an Ojibwe kid too, Charlie Winjack, taken off and trying to walk home in the winter, and all he had was a windbreaker and some tennis shoes and froze to death. He was following the railroad tracks to the west trying to get back home, froze to death trying to get there. That called some attention to it. But, I mean, there were hundreds of Charlie Winjacks over the years. Mm-hmm. So you got this literal physical mortality, and 50%. You can take the man at his word. He is the guy in charge of Ministry of Indian and Northern Affairs. It's called in Canada. That's the BIA in a way, as it would be down here. So he would not be overstating the case, and it wasn't like he was ignorant of the data. So take him at his word. 1 and 2, that's 50% mortality rate in these schools, and it's children. It's exclusively children.
That's right. That's right.
Down 3 and 4 years old and running up into their teen years. Okay, but children, all of them. Mm-hmm. All right. Just for some comparative purposes, excluding the Operation Reinhard camps and the other extermination centers in Poland and elsewhere in the East, not extermination camps per se, but concentration camps. And there's a distinction to be drawn between the two. The worst of the concentration camps in terms of mortality is Mauthausen. And the mortality rate there was about 60%, 65% in that range. Okay, the schools are running 50%. So you're talking mortality rate on the level of, say, Dachau, famous German concentration camp.
These were all children, too.
And these were all children, and they were forced labor and indoctrination. Well, the very best you come out, you'll have some of them speak fondly. The indoctrination took hold. Mm-hmm. Okay, including Leah's father, who conceded most of everything that I was on about. Yeah, that's true, and I know about that. And he was in residential school, so he experienced it. And it really messed him up. One thing, he was dedicated to creating Indian-controlled schools that on his reserve, Sabascong Bay, or Kuchiching as it's called, okay, and got the first one going there. So it was a sort of breakthrough. He was an important figure in that, but he was also a terrible alcoholic. Mm-hmm. I mean, self-concept, his family had been destroyed. He and all of his brothers were that way, And that's the sort of thing that was happening. But he'd look back, before I get off on the next thing I was going to say, he'd look back and say, but, despite all the gloom and doom about the residential schools, the closest friends I ever made were in the residential schools, which is true. You had a bonding among the students. So, they would say it that way. And it's an attempt to find a hook, some kind of human hook in that whole experience, I'm sure. But what you would have as a result of that is what Judith Herman calls complex PTSD. I mean, post-traumatic stress disorder is triggered by a traumatic event. And there's a whole range of things that qualify. And there's been studies done on, natural disasters like a dam breaking in Pennsylvania, and this community was virtually wiped out, and the survivors of that had tremendous trauma that had to be reconciled. Combat veterans, often there's something that happens that's going to trigger that. Sexual abuse.
Yes, you
rape.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, various things. But what you're saying, with complex PTSD, it's not an event.
That's right.
It's repetitive events. Just keeps happening over and over and over again. Okay, that's the condition of people coming out of the residential schools. But if you're in that condition, what do you do? You're going to try to reconstitute some kind of life, something that resembles normal. You're probably going to look to your own group. So it's going to be Indians, and probably Indians that have also undergone that experience. They're traumatized too. You got all these concomitants to complex PTSD, like empathy impairment and so forth. I mean, you're emotionally numb. You're trying to form bonds. You want to create a normal environment. Family constitutes normal for almost everybody. Not entirely, but that's a sort of normal. But you have no experience with a family because you're institutionally raised, and abusively so for the most part. Okay, and you cannot meet the ideal. I mean, you've been trained generally for menial level. You got a destroyed self-concept, self-esteem. You're in a society that kind of reviles you anyway. Racial epithets. All of that media depiction stuff that we were talking about, plus Wigwam Hotel, Big Chief, writing tablets, Hiawatha pencils, blah, 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 blah. There's thousands of products trivializing, commodifying Indians.
Yep.
A great joke. Cigar store Indians. All of that visible and apparent. Yep. Continuous tone. Chances are you're not holding a job, and if you do, it's low paying, and you can't provide for your children. And so now I got this background, and I'm a failure, and alcoholism is just catastrophic in so many circles. And when you talk about this isn't drinking socially. This is drinking like Nicolas Cage and leaving Las Vegas. Amounts of alcohol drunk for effect, and the effect is I want to just obliterate my consciousness.
Yeah.
Okay. John, her father, told me that he finally was prompted to stop drinking when the alcoholics in the alley wouldn't associate with him anymore.
Wow.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the children are all experiencing this, all the collateral effects. So they're being traumatized. This is intergenerational. It's communicable because the parents are traumatizing children by virtue of their trauma.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. In the schools, you had students trying to get home, fleeing, trying to get home to escape the trauma. The next generation, 2 generations, are home. Where do they run to? There you have it. I mean, so you've got this cultural trauma as a real thing, and it's transmissible over multiple generations. I don't think the trauma of slavery is in any sense gone away.
Oh, no.
Even by the most accommodationist. The accommodationist is simply the current manifestation of what was called the House Negro. Okay. Integrationist is, hey, maybe I can be a free black in a racist society, something like that.
We've heard that.
See, you had that. And the impulse is to try to fit in.
Yep.
You're trying to fit into a society that reviles you so much they tried to destroy you individually and collectively. And still doing it. And denies that they had anything but the best intentions while ever tragic the results. Use that word tragedy in conjunction with Ferguson. All right. Let me suggest an alternative term: atrocity. Nothing tragic about it. It was deliberate and it was intentional.
Yep.
And was
There you go. There you go.
And we got this systemic atrocity. But he's trying to fit in. It's almost like the Stockholm syndrome, you know, people who are absolutely disempowered and held at the whim of those who have taken them hostage.
Yep.
And still also trying to, you counter purposes, you're trying to salvage some pride in your own traditions. You know, a lot of these people trying to get back. Some of them repudiated all, one nothing to do with indigenous society. Others trying to relearn. And the Kelly boys, the brothers, the other two, maybe more than John, although he wasn't unconversant. And he was really fluent in his language, but he wouldn't let his children learn it.
I remember you said that in the book. Yeah, he could speak his language.
On a useful language. Wanted Leah to study French, which she did. And she was desperately trying to learn her own language towards the end. Yeah. Well, she was smart. Here's how you fit in. Okay? You learn about the dominating, the colonizing, the whatever term you want to put, society. She could talk Sartre. She could talk European philosophy to a certain extent, cinematic theory, aesthetic theory, art history, and all the rest of that. She was going to school at University of Colorado. Not a whole lot of Indians there. She had some friends that were Indians, but none of them were Ojibwe. That's something that would be understood among the Indians, but most of the friends, she was in our school. There were a couple of Indians there, one painter and one graduate student. But the teacher is not somebody she can be socializing with, and the graduate student was a guy. So that had its limits too. Her little pack were all white women. Okay? And she could talk their culture with them better than they could. But there was no expectation they considered reasonable that they know anything at all about her.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, that complex of things, and there's more that you could go into, but I mean, this is an emblematic story. And this is someone who excelled. But it was just closed down, destructive. To the pattern. And maybe she was trying to make a connection with her father, figuring out where it was that he had been in terms of the alcohol. But I mean, the problems went much deeper than that, went into childhood. And it wasn't because she was abused in a conscious way by parents, but that whole context created by the residential schools and the trauma that he suffered and all that made an abusive situation, even though he wasn't abusing her sexually, physically, or otherwise. It was an impossible situation. So it ended up being self-nullification. A borderline personality, she couldn't figure out who it was she was supposed to be, was allowed to be, might be. She had all these conflicting tendencies, aspirations, if you will, that were arguing in both sides of her head at once, all the time. So, self-destruction. And that's not uncommon.
No.
Indigenous people generally have extraordinarily high rates of suicide directly. And of course, the kind of drinking I was talking about is essentially slow motion suicide. So you have these abbreviated lifespans. If you took that as a proportion of the population, you got a genocidal impact that way. But in the denial and all the rest of that, and the misrepresentation of reality, you've got an ongoing cultural genocide in any case. So now I need to take a break. I'll be right back.
"13 miles from Paul Bullard's home is a public housing project in familiar red brick. It is like most such projects in most big cities. And cemented into the red brick are a series of public policies that work against the children of the poor. Because housing for the poor is scarce, the 1,100 apartments hold not the officially registered 6,000, but with unofficial residents, relatives, and friends, more like 8,000. Because mothers travel up to 4 hours a day to work in downtown office buildings or suburban homes, their children are left to care for each other or for themselves.
I remember turning 13, still a little innocent, losing my religion just a little slow. 100 loose joints under my Kango, lease suits with the stitch creases, fat laces in my suede Adidas, toothbrush if I need to clean them, belt buckle with my name on it. Hella youngins try to jump me for it. Urban struggle, birth a couple scuffles. Took a couple L's, couple W's. Before bitches were BMWs. She had a bubble, we became a couple. I like to thank the niggas I grew up with, and all the grown-ups to stop us from doing stupid shit. Even though we gravitated towards stupid shit. Ghetto full of life, nothing to do with it.
We have been saying that poor children who depend on the benevolence of public policies suffer from policies that are far from benevolent.
I think that if children are deprived of the things they need, both physically and psychologically at a young age, that there comes a point in which they cannot be redeemed.
I remember turning 15, left the youth detention center just a year ago. The best food, clothing, shelter was a homeless shelter. Self-esteem flatlining everything inside them. Took a lot of risks, played a lot of games. Some touched death, some niggas got maimed. Some finished school, some made a little name. Some made a little money, some a little fame. But sometimes you can't shake that grind. Fighting the odds against poverty, crimes and shit, that's design. I mean, focus in retrospect, the ghetto it functions just like apartheid. At 16, I got a part-time job. My ass was pumping gas up on Oden Ave. I got 5 for being tired of understanding math, counting thousands of dollars or some crack of cash.
And I would use that word redeemed in all of its psychological and spiritual implications. They become hopelessly thwarted, stymied, atrophied. The heart dies, the mind becomes filled with all of the hate.
I remember turning 17, pregnant lady selling ass just to get a blast. Innocence, exit stage left, not a lot of days left. At the age where you end up in a cage if you escape death. Everybody on the block, kitchen rocks in them. Project women stimming so they spots rent them. We can rent a smoke a whipper for a couple cracks. Couldn't drive, bring it back with a couple cracks. Dumb as fuck, still flirting with supreme wisdom. 120 God's ass, she was in the building. She was different, a lot of niggas was attracted to her. I got the math, only 5% truly knew her. Even fewer do her, others just profess to. Cause urban underdevelopment will arrest you. Real speaks the tendencies of everyday people. The unfair's hopeless, penny hole in it.
And multiply this child by many child, and we have many sins. And multiply this enough, and I think you have national sins, not just the individual sins that we all commit from day to day, but a national failure of determination, an ethical failure, and in many respects, a slow kind of suicide, in which one generation commits another generation in significant numbers to be hurt and killed, I would say, in spirit.
You have an option, I suppose, since we're talking about cultural fluency and all of that, and finding a way to fit in there. You can always become Thomas Sowell or something like that. And he's really conversant with a lot of European tradition. I would expect that his knowledge of African tradition is about negative numbers, but I don't know that for sure. He certainly doesn't make any intelligent reference to it. And that, that was, she was being embraced in that way. That was the trajectory she could have gone, but it was a direction she could have gone in the sense that it would have been accepted for her to do that. And then she would have been encouraged and reinforced and all the rest of it. But it wasn't a direction she could have gone and remained in any sense true to herself. There's that conflicted aspect. And so there's that internal war going on.
Mm-hmm.
My stuff scared her. People that I associated with and such. There were some rough people in the loop. Name stuff. And I can understand why that would scare her. And one of her uncles had been involved with Anishinaabe Park and stuff. And the Kelly boys were notorious in general, especially the oldest one, who was big. He was bigger than the others. Her father was a small man, but his oldest brother was good size. And they get drinking and, just go clear out a bar. Bam.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't the direction for her to go either. And, Dame security people and stuff, you're ratcheting it up a little higher than what the Kelly boys were doing. Okay. I was tight with Bob Robidoux, who was one of Peltier's co-defendants.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This sort of scared the whole family, I think, in a way. But, and she didn't want to go into that either. So then the direction is, which direction can she go?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I don't have an answer to that. Not for her. I couldn't answer. I think I also said in that you're reading from, I can think of 1,000 things I did wrong.
I remember you said that.
I don't have an answer to what it was I could have done right. It's not something I created. It was a dynamic, a phenomena that I kind of understood and trying to reinforce and encourage and all of that. But you can't solve it for someone else. You can just try to create a context, and the context frightened her because it's a frightening context.
Yeah.
It's, man. Yeah.
It's pretty sad.
Well, the thing is, kind of like, reading it is kind of like, you got, Ward Churchill, and, it's kind of like why people say, like, well, if y'all had kids, they'd be born revolutionaries or whatever. Not necessarily. It's kind of like you said. It's kind of like the whole conflict. If I'm black, does that mean I know how to use a Mac 11, a Glock, and shoot and do drive-bys or clear out bars, or,
Mm-hmm.
so, but then I don't want to be black like you, because that shit kind of scares me as well. And it's kind of like you said, it's like, I've dealt with people, you try to give a context and everything, but it's kind of like they don't, you can't say, it's really hard because you can see yourself as like, I got all these books and I've done certain things, and you think you can have the answers, but when you're dealing with real people, it's no longer like
people react to things differently.
It's not different. And going back to something you said on page 346 is footnote 118. I just want to read this to the listener. You said, even in optimal circumstances, a decisive termination of the active source of trauma and a social environment facilitating potential recovery, there can be no realistic expectations that the aftershocks of traumatic damage ever completely dissipate.
Yeah.
And, somebody, will say, well, they told me, can't you give this youngster this book or whatever? It's like, sometimes people have been through so much.
Yeah, you can't do just.
it gets real personal.
It does.
And the essay is really personal. Some of this, I mean, it was a tearjerker, man. I'm not, because it's like, man, it was really like, I was surprised you shared that because I was like, shit, it was really intense, man. It was,
Oh, yeah, when they had that little saying, kill the Indian, save the man, they're not saving anybody. They're just making a bunch of broken people.
Yes. And,
Yeah.
that's out of Fanon and stuff, but it is.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about his answer, you got to cut the colonizer's throat.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with that. Not everybody can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And, he meant it quite literally.
Yeah, he
There's
did.
ways to do it, but you got to figure out how.
Mm-hmm.
But,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, and also the fact that like when y'all kept trying to get her help, it was just, and how like they didn't want to give it the proper diagnosis because then it might affect their careers, and you can't take anything out of the context that you're in terms of even when we look for help, so to speak, and it was the same society that destroyed her.
Yeah.
Yeah. The whole therapeutic paradigm is established to take the individual and adjust them
Yep.
to whatever it was that, to put it in street language, drove them nuts.
Mm-hmm.
The problems with them, not with the circumstance
Yep.
that created the effect, accommodationism.
Mm-hmm.
And you see a parallel to the integrationist dynamic there. It's accommodationist. It's trying to fit in, alleviate the pain by assuming that there's something about you that is causing the infliction of the pain.
Yeah.
And there's something wrong with the person or institution, whatever, that's inflicting it. It's like, hey, the Jews they brought it on themselves by being different.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't anything wrong with the Nazis.
Exactly
Mm-hmm.
right.
Yeah.
Absurd on its face, but that's the nature of what we're doing here. The thing in the therapeutic box, the therapeutic state, as it was called, everybody needs a bit of counseling to adjust them properly to social compliance.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the problem with borders, according to Herman. And there's that inside joke that I quoted in there. What do you do when you diagnose your client as being borderline? The answer, refer them. Okay. Because, it may never go away, but the only even partial resolution is the alteration of the circumstance that created the condition. Right. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the notion of radical therapy, as I understood it, was that, well, in simplest form, revolution is the only therapy that's going to have any effect.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
In this chapter, real personal chapter, it also kind of reminded me of something you said in Pacifism as Pathology talk when that guy said that, peaceful, find ways where he can still maintain his privilege. And you was like, we're talking about a real horror show over there. We're talking about real babies. This is not some abstract conversation. And kind of like how you mentioned on page 331 in Wielding Words as Weapon, in this same chapter, you said, I, along with many others, have tried to address this reality in various ways, resorting mostly to language and pretensions of objective scholarship, deploying our graphs and charts, our proportionalities, and other statistics, our historiographical and sociological and legal definition. In this, despite our best intentions, we have in many respects, perhaps most, served mainly to consummate the very crime we purport to oppose, objectifying and thus dehumanizing the victims, making the nature and magnitude of their suffering appear sterile academic as lifeless and inconsequential as even the most vile of perpetrators might wish them to be. There is a distinctively repugnant aroma of detachment, of distance, and unreality about it all, as if what were at issue amounted only to grist for study groups and parlor debates. And I want to just say, I've talked to various academics and stuff, and they study quote unquote black issues and oppressed issues, and in the circles they hang in, they don't know nobody that missed no meal. They don't even know, they still think it's food stamps instead of Lone Star cards and stuff. They don't know, what I'm Lone Texas, okay, Lone Star, that's the food stamp card. But basically my point is, they don't know nobody been unemployment. It's all academics. You know what I'm saying? And they don't live with these people. They just kind of like study them as things. They thingify them, So when I read the chapter, it's like, well, this is Ward Churchill. Why don't he work, not me, but people might say, well, can't he work some Ward Churchill magic and, make it? Well, that's what people think. They think stupid shit like that. It should rub off, but we dealing with real people who are really colonized. Ain't just some cute fucking word I like to sound to be edgy at a cocktail party. I don't even go no goddamn cocktail. It's people's lives are affected. If you in Atlanta, right, I want you to go see how many young black women you see with blue contacts, blue eyes, and blonde hair saying, I ain't got nothing to do with no nigga from Africa. It's real people. It's messed up. It's family members that say, I've had people tell, as long as it's white, I buy it. You get them niggas around me, I ain't gonna do nothing. These are real life. We can make, I be joking about it sometimes because like you said, I'm trying to get a grip on reality, but it's some bad shit. And I'm just emphasizing. And it's the same thing, like you said, when Leah's father was like, I'm going to get this education out of redness. I'm not going to be Indian. And he was put in his place by the colonial society. And how do you deal with that shit? This ain't no easy thing to come up with. It's struggle. It's intergenerational, like you said. So
it sure is.
Yeah. There's no painless route to it. Then that's my old rap about can't change your diet, listen to the right music, read the right books, okay, burn the right incense, blah, 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 better bike paths, all of that shit. So the Algerians, I mentioned Fanon, took them 1 million to 1.5 million people dead in that war of liberation and kick loose from the settler colonial. Well, I mean, that's ghastly toll. Except, you got to understand in the context of people dying continuously, prematurely, immiserated for the duration of their lives. That's the cost of not stepping up to it.
That's right.
So, and it just goes on and on and on while people circle the same old rock like alchemists, pretending that if you repeat the same failed experiment that is relatively safe for me and mine, long enough, often enough times, it's going to produce a different result. I mean, that's positively medieval thinking there. And they complain about fundamentalist Islam being medieval.
I know, right? Exactly.
Yeah, it's just really crazy, especially how like you brought out in the Canadian or residential schools, like the abuse, like eating vomit, the sexual abuse of the children. And I can't remember the actual, because I didn't take it down in my notes. It was somebody at a residential school. I think it was in a footnote, or somebody said like, if we were to try to repair on par or something, we couldn't do that. We would bankrupt or something. Basically, it was like, we ain't got nothing for you, and we know we fucked up, and it's like, so what? It's...
Well, and they put the weight on the victims again.
Yes.
Like, there were some of those schools where the sexual predation went to 100%.
Oh,
everybody.
And these are children now.
And these are children. But, I mean, among other things, as an adult, that's really fucking sensitive,
Yeah.
And Canada convened these tribunals to prosecute some of the offenders that were still alive, but it meant that their victims as adults who have been not wanting to talk about and disclose this violation of themselves, this really, really intimate thing when they were children, You know, they were compelled to testify. Yeah. So suicides among the victims, some of the guys, a little handful talking to prove the system works, justice was done and all that shit. They went to prison. But their victims in the process put in prison ended up pulling the plug altogether. That's the way the process works. You know?
And this is how you build a settler colonial nation. This isn't like aberrant. This is how it rolls.
It is.
Now that takes you around to the logic of Fanon.
Yeah.
Okay? It would have been far more empowering, not destructive, for the victims to just slit the guy's throat. You know, fully deserving of it, but that would disempower the state that had created that situation in the first place. Now it gets to preside over the justice of the outcome. No, justice would have been, I'm going to sever his jugular and my relation to the state and its sense of justice, you know, entitlement to that status. It's guilty as he is, both at the same time.
All right, this is where we got to leave it for now, but not to fret. If you want to finish listening to Wielding Words Like Weapons with Ward Churchill, Part 3, the conclusion of the series in its entirety, all you have to do is go to our store. There you will have access not only to this particular interview, but to all of C101's unabridged interviews, musical commentaries, and merchandise. And most importantly, you will be supporting 100% independent media. Yeah. We promise you, just as with all of our unabridged interviews, the podcast was just the tip of the iceberg. We touch on so much more, so you definitely want to get the unabridged interview of Wielding Words Like Weapons with Ward Churchill, Part 3, where in addition to what you just heard, we discuss
the following.
Ward, we want you to know if you could also discuss what you describe as Eurofeminism, which is what could be considered by settler society as the good colonizers attempting to speak for colonized women and supplant themselves as the oppressed altogether. Goes into detail on that on page 237, listening audience. We can see this phenomenon currently manifesting itself with the Me Too hashtag, right? And with the repopularization of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. It's, you know, everybody's like, oh my God, can you believe when they enslave somebody, they change their name? Oh my goodness.
God.
I actually had somebody tell me that. Somebody I work with was like, hey, you know, they don't have their own names. Ironically, my name's James Stone, right? That's a real African sounding name. Hank Brown, anyway. And ironically, Atwood is a settler from the settler colonial polity of Canada, you know, and the dilettante's research ethic of what white folks did to indigenous people would make her little Handmaid's Tale look like Walt Disney. I just want to throw that in there because but you know, this is oppression never seen before because it happened to what was her name? I forgot her name. The whatever in the main character. Anyway,
I forgot her name too.
Airstreet or whatever.
I tried to forget that show.
I know. Also the book. I remember I read the book. I was like, this is a nice version of slavery or something, right? Also. Could you also tie, you know, how they're trying to supplant colonial indigenous people's struggles? Also, could you tie that, and also how do they do the same thing in regards to homosexuality? Yeah, I went there. A particular Western cultural attribute to indigenous people as a way, as they mentioned earlier, to vitalize their colonial hold on Turtle Island. And I'm particularly referring to a footnote 147 on page 266. And I just want to say real quick an anecdote because I remember one time somebody had told me a white homosexual had went to Chiapas, right? And they was like wanted to see, you know, go to Chiapas and see how they was struggling, the Zapatistas and stuff. And then the white homosexual conferred to somebody that talked to me. I didn't know the white person who said the homosexual said it, but the guy said to me the white homosexual was really upset. And he was like, I don't see how the Zapatistas are making any homosexual headway. You know, now here it is. They're trying to like usurp everybody's struggle and put forth what they want. And then going back to your the footnote on 147 on page 266, how they're trying to make their problems or their contradictions or say that homosexuality was also found in indigenous societies. It was also found in African societies, as opposed to being a culture particular. Every contradiction they had in their nation is a universal problem. Therefore, there is no hierarchy. Only our problems get hierarchy. You know, and then go ahead, Ward, take it away. You go ahead.
Well, again, I mean, it's sort of like opening up the can on cinema. It covers a lot of ground. What I was talking about at the time, I think, when I made the critique in Eurofeminism, had to do with a definite strategy that was undertaken to promote something within the settler society, the Euro-American society, to maybe initially equivalence with race as an issue, but ultimately to supplant it. Again, putting white oppression, real or imagined, and it, you know, it's a patriarchal society. A lot of the critique is sound in a way, except it's juxtaposing competition with. Now, an illustration of what I'm talking about was there were issues in SNCC, which I'm aware of. I knew Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture reasonably well. We talked about various things when we were writing. He'd come over to dinner when he was at my place. I cooked for him. When he was in Denver, he also was on the ground with us in South Dakota several occasions. So that was over a period of years. But there was an issue, and he kind of described it, that there was a bona fide issue in SNCC having to do with relations between male and female. But what was driving it to a level of intensity were complaints by the white women, and this is before the whites were expelled. And one reason why they were expelled, not the only reason by any stretch, but a reason, was the white women were actually organizing a sort of a protest, preempt issues under discussion at the annual meeting about the discrimination involved in. They were assigned all but exclusively to work in the offices as teachers in freedom schools and various things like that, not allowed to do field organizing. And the reason for that was real simple. It dictated by the environment. You know, you a black male and a white female out doing field organizing, black hill. Simple as that. You know, and I say it's not the only reason, but it figures into, we don't need white people to organize the black community. The problem is the white community. Maybe you all ought to go organize that rather than coming in insisting in equal place in terms of organizing our community. But there were problems, issues. I don't even know if they were problems, but there were issues raised, some black women too, Ruby Doris and others. And the attitudes of some of the men was untoward. Okay? Stokely was something, he should have been a stand-up comic in some ways. It could be downright funny. He could do a comedy routine and have it, and break tension that way, among other things. So this was coming to a head during the annual retreat meeting that they were having there. And that evening, I mean, it had been debated and tempers flared and so on. In the evening, when everybody was just kicking around, he had done one of his little comedy things. So this was the issue of the day. And he parodied, lampooned ridiculed, if you will, by impersonating the attitudes in exaggerated form that were objectionable among some of the men. And that's where that famous line, well, we understand that the position of the woman in SNCC is prone.
Prone, yeah.
And everybody laughed. And Casey Hayden and Mary, whatever her name was, and it's escaping me right now, who were there, were at pains for decades after that thing. That was not a serious comment. Mm-hmm. That was a joke, and it was intended to further the women's agenda, you know? And as Ruby Doris said, well, Stokely was the one man that I could count on to back me in decision-making and such in SNCC. It was a woman who wasn't even there who took that as evidence of black male sexism, the sexism of the black rights movement. Okay, it's become an archetype of male sexism, macho, insensitivity, and so on and so on and so on. Still getting repeated by black women now in black feminist literature as if it was true. That was conscious, intentional, deliberate, counter the facts, but it was for political advantage, and it was to demote the ascendancy of black power politics that was prevailing at the time and promote, well, they call it the women's movement or feminism, but it really wasn't at that time. They first two women's feminist conclaves, whatever, a national level that I'm aware of, black women were explicitly excluded. It was a white women's.
That's right.
Congregation.
Now they're trying to make it all women.
And, you know, perhaps there's some issues that need to be addressed. I think feminism is inherently part of humanism. You know, I don't think it's separable, but it's treated as if it were separable.
That's right. That's right.
That's what they exactly.
But that's what they culture do.
Yeah, and
that's what they be doing.
But it was to demote the issue of race and promote the issue of sex or sexual discrimination, first between the sexes, and then, you know, gay and transgender and all that. Really is an extension from that.
Yeah, it is.
Not that it's something new that it was invented as a result, but there was an empowerment to carry it that direction.
Oh, yeah. You know you want to finish what Brother Ward was expounding on because we go into so much more. So pick up Wielding Words Like Weapons with Ward Churchill, Part 3. Link to this Unabridged interview is in our show notes, and we will link to parts 1 and 2 of the Unabridged interviews in the show notes so you can get all of it together. All right, this episode has featured music from
Conscientization 101. Decolonize this, properly defining settlers. Part 1. From our musical commentaries collection. Wise Intelligent, featuring Black Page, by design. From his album, Ponzi.
Links to featured music are once again in our show notes. In addition to linking to Brother Ward's Wielding Words Like Weapons, selected essays in Indigenism 1995 through 2005, we also have included links to other works by him. And also we have linked to his forthcoming book, which is available for pre-order, From a Native Son, Selected Essays in Indigenism 1985 through 1995. All right. Now don't forget, when you visit us at conscientization101.com or c101magazine.com, sign up to our mailing list for exclusive information and downloads. Hit up our store where you can download our free gift today. Pick up an unabridged interview or two. Pick up a few musical commentaries and a shirt. Support 100% independent media so we can continue to learn from each other. Also, don't forget to check us out on Twitter at Conscien1, that's CONSCIEN1, on Facebook at Conscientization 101, and Instagram at C101 Editors. We want to thank Brother Ward for taking time out of his schedule to dialogue with us. We hope you enjoyed this series, and know that you will find Brother Ward's work an invaluable weapon for conscientization. Thanks for listening. We'll see you soon.
Peace.
Conscientization.